Death of a Game, Troika Games. Death of a Game is a series where I, nerdSlayer, take a look at games or companies that have died over the years and attempt to analyze the largest contributing factors and such. I will also talk about the legacy this said game or company left on the video game world. Understand that the first half of the video is a retelling of events and a history lesson on the game or company in question, while the second part serves more as an editorial on why I think the game or company failed. The second half of the video is ultimately my opinion, but it is an opinion that I have obtained through rigorous research, as well as personal experiences. At the end of this video, I hope that you will have a better understanding of why the game or company in question failed. Troika Games was a rather popular company that had a rather abrupt death. They were well known for their cult classics like Arcanum and Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. Troika Games, in my opinion, are the perfect company to start off covering a company in this series. Since this is my first time on Death of a Game covering a company, the format is going to be a little bit different, but as always, the first part of the video is going to start with the history, and in this case, the history of Troika Games. Troika Games quite possibly is one of the most well-known flash-in-the-pan companies. They hit the scene quite quickly and boasted some strong, although flawed projects. In order to understand the origins of Troika Games, you have to understand the history of the three co-founders of the company, Tim Kaine, Leonard Boyarsky, and Jason D. Anderson. These three previously had worked at the legendary Interplay, where they all previously had pivotal positions working on one of the most iconic RPGs of our generation, Fallout. Kaine was the lead programmer, Boyarsky as the art director, and Jason Anderson was the lead artist. Tim Kaine most famously was the lead force behind the Fallout engine and the systems in the game.
This is for Chris and Tim. Where do you guys start with something like Fallout? Do you kind of have an idea? Do you work off of something else? Do you take somebody else's idea and steal it and call it your own?
Well, Tim, I think in terms of building a world just from scratch, like you have actually far more experience than I do. Like, and when I worked on like Fallout 2 in New Vegas, that was all building on the Fallout franchise.
True, but I mean, you added a ton of stuff to that.
You know what? I'm not going to trade compliments with you anymore.
I think, at least for the genesis of Fallout, it came from wanting to make a game that was in the style of 50s movies that we all liked. Mm-hmm. And we named a bunch of movies and a bunch of books that we'd like to watch. And this is just at the genesis of making art for games with CGI instead of doing it like with V-Paint or by hand. So it was the genesis of 3D art. And the guys who were working on it really wanted to do something that looked gritty rather than CG at the time. Everything looked plastic and shiny. But they didn't want to do a game like that. They wanted the game to look gritty. And so from that, we kind of developed, well, it's going to be a wasteland type game, a post-apocalyptic game.
While Boyarsky most famously was the artist behind the Vault Boy design, which is a pretty significant part of the game.
I'm Leonard Boyarsky. I've been making video games for just about 25 years. These are some of the games I've been fortunate enough to have worked on. I've been an artist, designer, writer, art director, project director, even CEO.
And although they started to work on a sequel to Fallout, Fallout 2, after the initial design was complete, they ended up leaving the company together, citing issues with the future team structure. This is probably also related to the fact that they weren't exactly thrilled that although they felt that Fallout was their baby, they didn't have the rights to it on what Boyarsky deemed a technicality. When later interviewed after Bethesda bought the rights to Fallout, Boyarsky had this to say on the matter. To be perfectly honest, I was extremely disappointed that we did not get the chance to make the next Fallout game. This has nothing to do with Bethesda. It's just that we've always felt that Fallout was ours, and it was just a technicality that Interplay happened to own it. It sort of felt as if our child had been sold to the highest bidder, and we had to just sit by and watch. Since I have absolutely no idea what their plans are, there in this case being Bethesda, I can't comment on whether or not I think they're going in the right direction with it, or not. Boyarsky also had this to say after he left Interplay. Interplay had been a great place to work, and we felt that it was losing a lot of what made it felt great. They were making a lot of bad decisions that would ultimately destroy the company. We were about 5 or 6 years early on that, but we saw the writing on the wall. If Baldur's Gate hadn't hit big, Interplay might well have imploded much earlier. but we left about a year before Baldur's Gate was even released. So when Kane, Boyarsky, and Anderson formed Troika Games in 1998, what was important for them was that they created a company that had a strong culture, much like that they were used to in the early Interplay days. Troika in Russian meant three of any kind, which of course was very fitting as the company was founded by three. An example of this culture that they wanted to create was described by Anderson in an interview he did on the Escapist magazine, The Rise and Fall of Troika, an article I really recommend reading because I source it a lot in this video, and frankly speaking, it's very well done. Anderson says, "We had a casual environment, open hours, we kept the fridge and kitchen fully stocked with sodas and snacks, had weekly lunch catered in, or barbecues on the patio, took everyone to movie premieres, matched their retirement plans a full 3% with no vesting period, had very competitive pay scales, and put most of the employees into offices rather than cubicles. We had a lounge with couches and console games, and a big screen TV, game nights, and etc. It was clear having a fun and laid-back culture was important for Troika Games, as was having a culture that was conducive to harboring talent and creating a quality game. It's easy to see some similarities in this company structure with well-known and strong companies of today like Google and Facebook. And to think, Troika was started back in 1998, so in a lot of ways, they were far ahead of their times in terms of progressiveness. But ultimately, the three founders were interested in making a video game. And that's what they did with their first title, Arcanum, of Steamworks and Magic Obscura, which released in 2001.
I haven't got much time. You must find the boy. Find the boy and give him back his ring. He will know what needs to be done. Now listen to me. We had to do it. He did unspeakable things to us, and we had no choice but to do as he said. And there are so few of us left that the work is almost finished, and then the evil, you can't imagine. He's coming back to destroy everything and everyone. Now, please, just find the boy. Tell him that I escaped. I came back to warn. He will know what to do. You, my friend, it's all up to you.
The game was met with a positive response, though many people were critical of the bugs present in the game and the frankly boring and uninspiring gameplay. Arcanum was launched the same year as Diablo 2's Lord of Destruction expansion and Baldur's Gate 2, so their lackluster home-built engine was no competition for the powerful engines that both Blizzard and BioWare were able to boast. To make matters worse for Arcanum, it used a infamous copy protection software, Secu-ROM, which caused audio and CD-ROM issues. What was most impressive about the game, however, was that they were able to start developing it with just a 3-man team that later expanded to just 12 people. And that was only when they started to be published by Sierra Entertainment. For the initial design of Arcanum, it was just Tim, Jason, and myself for 5 months until we landed a contract. The contract that they secured, as I mentioned, was with Sierra Entertainment, which then allowed them to expand it to 12 people. But still, 3 people for 5 months? That's pretty crazy for a game the size of Arcanum. Bugs and shoddy gameplay aside though, the world of Arcanum was incredible. It masterfully mixed the interesting duality of magic and technology, and had interesting quests that could range from investigating a murder to participating in a debate. The character creator for 2001 was nothing short of a masterpiece, a classless character creator that had choices that truly affected the player and his playthroughs. No one character would ever play the same. Troika Games would go on to sell over 234,000 copies of Arcanum, with revenues in the $8.8 million range. Despite not particularly selling poorly, unlike their time at Interplay, Troika Games had to find a new publisher. Sierra Entertainment was facing issues of their own, and Troika Games was going to have to find somebody else willing to fund their next project and company during development. Troika Games began to work on a sequel to Arcanum, titled Journey to the Center of Arcanum, that would be using the Valve newest source engine. However, with Sierra Entertainment, as I mentioned, facing their own issues and then Valve rejecting the project, it looked like Troika Games was already going to have to fold up shop, especially because the contract that they secured for Atari was still a ways off. Luckily for Troika, however, Scott Lynch, who has supported Troika previously while working at Sierra Entertainment, was now working at Valve. Because of such, Valve helped Troika pitch at Activision for a chance to work on a vampire-themed game. So that meant that Troika Games wasn't going to have to close shop yet, but instead they had an incredibly grueling next few years that required constant crunch mode development. And it turns out that they were going to be doing 2 projects concurrently. In order to pay the bills, of course, Troika had to go out and secure contracts. Well, one of the contracts that they took was with Atari to remake a famous Dungeons & Dragons story module titled The Temple of Elemental Evil. Tim Cain was the only founder focused on the project, with what I would describe as a split team. The other part of the team, of course, was going to be working on the vampire-themed game, Vampire the Masquerade, Bloodlines. This was a vampire game that took place in the famous White Wolf universe that was published by Activision. The decision to split an already small development team on 2 titles surely hurt Troika Games, but they also had to pay their bills. It just so happened that the timing was unfortunate. Now they were going to have to push out 2 titles on an insane schedule. Think about that. 3 games in a mere 6 years. This equates to about the time that it takes a very large game like, say, Oblivion or Skyrim. The Temple of Elemental Evil was released first, to rather average fanfare, garnering the equivalent of a C grade from most companies. Still, it was able to sell 128,000 copies and approximately earned around $5.2 million in sales. Tim Cain's ability to craft a strongly animated and responsive CRPG was on display with the title, and the Temple of Elemental Evil stayed strong to its source content and maintained a strong D&D rule set. However, with a buggy and poor interface, a short story, and probably what some would call too complex of combat, especially if you're not familiar with the D&D rule set, it wasn't a very commercially viable game. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines was the other half of Troika Games' development team, also the other 2 founders, Boyarsky and Anderson. The game, when compared to their previous titles, was plagued with by far the most issues from its inception, and likely was the largest contributing factor to the death of Troika Games. But I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. Let's talk about the history of the game. Although Troika Games was excited that they were able to obtain a license to make a vampire game in the White Wolf universe, this proved to be more difficult than they had originally expected, especially when you introduce a publisher like Activision, who has their own expectations, versus White Wolf's, and of course, ultimately, Troika Games. Design by necessity had to become a lot more structured in a game like Vampire. We had to run everything not only by White Wolf, but by the publisher Activision as well. Instead of developing their own engine for Bloodlines, especially since they wanted it to be a 3D game, a game that they had not really created yet, they decided to go with a, at the time, prototype source engine from Valve, the same engine that was used for Half-Life 2. The engine featured lip-syncing vocals as well as a well-developed physics system and lighting system, something that a game like Half-Life 1, for example, was known for. This seemed like a good thing. They had shown a poor ability to develop their own in-house engine, at least an in-house engine that was stable enough to not be buggy, except in choosing Valve's source engine, they made a fatal flaw, a flaw they would only completely realize later. And the game was initially unveiled in May 2003 by Activision and was set tentatively to launch in early 2004. At this point in the development, the team size was around 32 people, which wasn't enough for a product of such scope that Troika Games was looking to create. But what was more problematic was, although the source engine was powerful, it was still a prototype, and one that Troika was ultimately unfamiliar with. Although the source engine helped bring life to Bloodlines characters in no ways RPGs had witnessed before, it also brought its own difficulties to the project. The engine was still in development at Valve in tandem with the creation of both Bloodlines and Half-Life 2, meaning the developers were working with a new, largely unfamiliar code, and tools with only one source of support if things went wrong. To make matters even worse, Troika's publisher Activision didn't even have a producer assigned to the project for a year of the project's lifespan. This was proved by the later elected producer, David Mullock, in an interview he did. I was then assigned to produce Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, which was already a year or more into development without an Activision producer being attached to ensure that everything was running smoothly. As a result, things were in a pretty sorry state when I came aboard, an unfinished design and game engine, and many game levels that were created and then thrown out and so on. Bloodlines was delayed from its early 2004 launch, primarily because Valve was hacked and the source code for the source engine was stolen, and as such, both games, Half-Life 2 and Bloodlines, were delayed as security measures had to be introduced. Jason Anderson came out and targeted a spring 2005 launch, and in the summer of 2004 at E3, they announced that they would introduce a multiplayer component for the game. Bloodlines will have a multiplayer mode. Activision and Troika say that they're going to integrate role-playing elements into the gameplay. For example, you can have a vampire against vampire hunters in team-based multiplayer with an ability to level up between rounds. There will also be more traditional combat and familiar modes. The game appears to be on track, and if everything goes according to schedule, we should see Bloodlines in stores by the end of the year. However, the writer of the article couldn't really have been further off the mark. Things were certainly not on schedule, and not on schedule since the very beginning. In fact, Activision was holding Troika to the garret and threatening to pull their funding, which would effectively destroy the company if they didn't release Bloodlines by the end of 2004. Not to mention, as David Mullock went on record to say, the supposed multiplayer was incredibly unfinished and ended up being completely scratched. Mullock had this to say in regards to the way the deadlines were handled with Troika Games. We set a couple of hard deadlines on the game's development, so that Troika would spend enough time on bug fixing, but the problem was that the team had done so much wheel spinning because they were working with an engine that was still in development that the game eventually ran over budget. Activision increased the budget and it extended the deadline several times. Activision eventually set a final code release date of September 15, 2004, if I recall correctly, and then it went into 3 weeks of testing because the game was just so huge. So even though the game needed more time, Activision surely wasn't going to give them more time. They forced Troika to hand over Bloodlines and were going to attempt to release the game as soon as they could. Except when Troika signed the license deal for the use of the source engine from Valve, Valve reserved the right to release their game first. As the Game Stalkers article put it, with quotes from David Mullock. That restriction turned out to be a blessing because Troika convinced Activision to spend more money on additional development in the meantime. I don't think it was enough to cover the entire team's cost because I heard that several team members agreed to work without salary because they believed in the game so much. So the team produced another code release candidate, which went on another 3 weeks of testing. That's the version that was used as the Gold Master. However, the game would have greatly benefited from an additional 2 weeks of polishing before launch. Even 1 day more of bug fixing would have made a noticeable difference. But Activision just had to say, stop, enough already, at some point as the game had gone way over budget. So in a way, Valve's holding the game's launch was actually beneficial for Troika. Well, up until Activision made the genius decision to launch the game the same day as Half-Life 2, one of the best and most iconic games of all time. Oh, and also to mention, Metal Gear Solid was also on shelves at the time. This surely contributed to the poor sales the Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines had upon its launch date on the 16th of November, 2004. The game was only able to sell a meager 72,000 copies, totaling in about $3.4 million in sales. For comparison, Half-Life 2 sold 6.5 million copies in a mere 4-year span. This, unfortunately, was a fatal blow to the troubled Troika Games, especially when some of their employees forgoed their pay in an attempt to fix the game. However, despite the poor sales figures for the game was generally well received, garnering an 80% on Metacritic from critics and nearly a 9 out of 10 from the audience. Strong writing, an immersive world, and a graphical delight both in ambience and sheer technical ability were all things that Bloodlines could boast as strengths. It was compared to other top RPGs of its time like Morrowind, Baldur's Gate, and KOTOR by critics. Some even likened it to Deus Ex with vampires, though I will talk a bit more about the positives of the game later when I take a look back at the legacy of Troika Games. The largest issue cited with the game, like the previous 2 Troika games, was just about the same thing. Technical problems, some being as little as graphical bugs, while some made the game completely unplayable. Regardless of how the audience or critics saw the game, the sales were so poor, and Troika desperately needed the game to sell well. It just didn't. It seemed that them being forced to launch on the same day of Half-Life 2 really did hurt their commercial viability. partly because of how popular Half-Life 2 was, but also due to the amount of real estate Half-Life 2 and Metal Gear Solid likely took up occupying on store shelves. Jason Anderson in an interview laid the blame squarely on the publisher Activision, saying that Activision took the game out of Troika's hands without ever giving them time to test and polish it. But like the article points out, at some point you have to place some of the blame on Troika's hands. They absolutely encountered very strong issues with the source engine, ones that they were barely equipped to handle. In some cases, they had to create their own code to supplement part of the source engines. This is outlined in a dev journal that Boyarsky did on GameSpot. To sum up the quote, Troika Games created their own lighting system because they needed a moodier lighting to fit what would be a vampire, slash dark universe. They also implemented their own cloth system, which allowed flowing cloaks to be in a game. And then of course they had to add things like a complex dialogue system, as well as things that weren't necessarily in first-person shooters, like stealth mechanics and role-playing mechanics. That was a lot on the plate of Troika Games, who by all standards not only had a small development team, but also a split one since the other half was still working on the Atari project at the time. Because Troika Games was without a publisher willing to back them solely, they had to serve as both the salesman and the creator. They went to different publishers, attempting to pitch new projects in order to secure funding to keep the company alive. In 2004, Boyarsky stated that they would love to do a sequel for Bloodlines, but that it was up to Activision whether or not that happened. Troika tried to pitch many ideas. One in particular was called Dreadlands, which was an MMORPG, or a multiplayer online game, set in the mythical mid-19th century Eastern Europe, and the other most famously was what some would call a possible spiritual successor to the original Fallout. There's actually footage of this basic design concept on YouTube, which undoubtedly looks very Fallout-esque. But Bethesda ultimately secured the rights to Fallout, and delivered what we all know as Fallout 3. Although Boyarsky and the guys at Troika were interested in doing a Fallout game, they didn't have the resources it took to bid on the intellectual property of the game, though some incorrectly think that Troika did bid on the game. But to clear up any confusion, Boyarsky was questioned on it and had this to say: "We never ever bid on Fallout. One major publisher mentioned Interplay was shopping it around, and would we be interested in developing it for them, but they dropped it as too expensive when they found out the asking price, not ours, Interplay's. We never had our own money, and we're just beginning to toy with the ideas of independent funding near the end of our life as a business," which was after Bethesda had already gotten Fallout. And so it looked like Troika Games, an independent company that didn't have a publisher backing them, was unable to secure funding for any future deals with other publishers. This was likely due to their shaky record of developing unfinished projects. As 2005 came around, this surely meant that the company would be soon facing its death. Anderson said in a quote, "Troika Games were considered B titles, and that publishers shun away from such." He also went on to say, "Unfortunately, although our games had depth and vision, we were never able to release a game that had been thoroughly tested and rid of bugs." And with no news of anyone being willing to back Troika Games, came with news of layoffs within the company. And on February 24th, 2005, news hit numerous sites that Troika Games would be closing their doors for good. Boyarsky had this to say in an email sent to various websites. "As many of you have already heard, Troika has laid off all of its employees and is closing its doors due to our inability to secure funding for future projects. We want to thank all of our fans for their support these past 7 years. It has really meant a lot to us that there were people out there who enjoyed our games enough to create fan sites and follow our progress as a company." There was still a little bit of a glimmer of hope, however, because Boyarsky went on to say that in the same email that fans shouldn't rule out the rebirth of Troika Games, and that they hadn't made up their minds of whether or not Troika Games would simply cease to exist. After Troika's demise, Leonard Boyarsky took a year off, citing burnout syndrome, which is categorized as overstressed and undermotivated. Upon his return in 2006, he would work for Blizzard as a lead world designer on Diablo 3 and its subsequent expansion, Reaper of Souls. Boyarsky by many would go on to be called the lorehead at Blizzard in regards to Diablo, and was very positively received by the community. Jason Anderson took a 3-year hiatus, where he focused more on real estate before returning to Interplay Entertainment in 2007 to begin work on a Fallout-related MMO. However, Bethesda disputed this, since they believed they had already purchased the rights to the title, which stalled the development and eventually curtailed it. Anderson left to work for Exile Entertainment in 2009, where he worked on Wasteland 2 as a designer and story writer. After leaving Exile, Anderson joined Turtle Rock Studios, who are the guys behind Evolve, which was shipped back in 2015. As far as I can tell, this is where he currently works, though in what capacity, that's kind of unknown at the moment. Tim Kaine, upon destruction of Troika Games, joined Carbon Studios up until 2011, where he was said to have worked on a fantasy MMO game for NCSoft. Maybe WildStar? Kaine then joined Obsidian Entertainment as a senior programmer, where he worked on Pillars of Eternity. Interestingly enough, Boyarsky also went to join Obsidian in 2016, where him and Tim would be working on an unannounced project that was not Tyranny, Pillars of Eternity, or their Armored Warfare game. Not much is known about this mysterious project, other than Boyarsky dubbed it as his dream game. What's interesting to note about the legacy of Troika Games titles are, even though the company was not able to be funded in the end and obviously had to stop its functions, their posthumous sales records for both Arcanum and Bloodlines skyrocketed their initial numbers. This is in large part due to the diehard fans of the company they had, who designed and developed community patches that helped eliminate bugs in games, as well as make them able to play on higher resolutions and with stronger graphic fidelity. Bloodlines is up to patch 9 in terms of community patching, and the patch not only fixes bugs and graphical issues, but it even adds cut content. An example of their sales skyrocketing posthumously is Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. Currently on Steam, it's sold over 500,000 copies, and that's not counting other marketplaces like GOG or Green Man Gaming either. Arcanum, on the other hand, has sold a little under 100,000 on Steam. These figures don't account for Steam sales and such, but it's still impressive that these games 10 years later were able to sell quite well. That speaks to the legacy of these games, but we're going to talk more about the legacy in the next portion of the video. And so that was the end of Troika Games. At the end of the retelling of events portion of the video, it's good to see that these three founders are still very much involved in the world of video games, and there's even a chance that Kaine and Boyarsky could be cooking up another great RPG. But that begs the question for some. If Troika Games was able to cultivate such a strong cult following, why didn't this transition to commercial viability during the time of their running as a company? Why did Troika Games die? That's what I hope to answer in the next part of this video. But first, let's talk about the legacy Troika Games left on the video game world. How will we remember Troika Games? What was their lasting impact on the industry? Culture. In the introduction of my video, I mentioned that the three founders behind Troika, Boyarsky, Anderson, and Kaine, all previously worked at Interplay. After leaving Interplay, as Boyarsky said in an interview, their basic goal was to create a company that felt like the old Interplay. And they were successful in that, I would say. They were able to have, as Anderson described in that previously mentioned quote, casual environment. They had catered lunches, matched retirement plans, very competitive pay scales, and put employees into offices instead of cubicles. They had game nights and TV and couches with console games and such. But their legacy goes past just what that quote communicated. How many times have you heard of an employee from a major company spilling the beans, if you will, talking about how they were forced to work these insane hours and how they were mistreated and not loved or whatever else? But this didn't happen with Troika. The Troika Games culture was so strong that members of the dev team were willing to crunch time for free. If you remember near the end of Bloodlines' development, they were desperately in need of money, and some of the workers on the project were willing to work for free. They truly believed in the product that they created. And this goes past just the founders too. And this culture, of course, extends to the products that Troika Games created, products that are still being updated and modded by the community till this very day. And that's sort of what I want to transition into. I want to talk about the two key projects that Troika Games produced and their legacies as games. Arcanum. Arcanum of Steamworks and Magic Obscura, a CRPG that came out back in 2001. At this point, the game certainly looks dated, being over 16 years old. But you can't mention the legacy of Troika Games without talking about their two most popular games, the first of course being Arcanum. Although from afar, Arcanum can look like a Diablo clone in regards to its UI elements, it's not the least bit comparative when it comes to the core aspects of the game. Arcanum is far more like Baldur's Gate. However, in my opinion, Arcanum has more of an open feel to its gameplay. It got a lot of the things that RPGs like to get right. For example, the character creator, as I mentioned in the beginning, is probably one of the best that I've ever used. Sure, the game lacks graphics, even for the time that it came out. However, the character creator is so awesome because it really adapts to the character that you choose to create. So if you make a half-orc with low intelligence, you will be treated as such by the game. Whether that means that people will be racist towards you or you can't complete certain types of quests until you increase your intelligence past a certain point. The same could be said if you played an elf mage. Some people will be hesitant around you due to the magic, which of course is a very strong focus of the game, the conflict between technology and magic, that is. Arcanum was about choice. It was about the features that made RPG games fun and unique. A character creator that really gave you the feel you were creating a character in a fascinating and unique world. The feeling we all wish to experience when creating a character in an RPG. And this brings me to the next part, the setting. Troika Games as a whole had an amazing ability to create fun and believable settings. When I say believable, of course you're in a fantasy universe, but I mean believable in regards to how it felt with the lore. This of course was on display with their very first project, if you want to call it that, Fallout 1. Arcanum on the other hand specifically was the idea of a fantasy world during the Industrial Revolution. It was something that hadn't quite been done to the extent that Troika Games did it. Now the next bit of Troika's legacy is of course their more mature look into the world of vampires.
Good evening. My fellow kindred, my apologies for disrupting any business or interfering with prior engagements you may have had this evening. It's unfortunate that the affair that gathers us together tonight is a troubling one. We are here because the laws that bind our society, the laws that are the fabric of our existence, have been broken. As prince, I am within my rights to grant or deny the kindred of this city the privilege of siring. Many of you have come to me seeking permission, and I have endorsed some of these requests. However, the accused that sits before you tonight was not refused permission. Indeed, my permission was never sought at all. They were caught shortly after the embrace of this child. It pains me to announce the sentence, as, up to tonight, I considered the accused a loyal and upstanding member of our organization.
Vampire the Masquerade, Bloodlines. What really made Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines such a cult classic? Commercially, we know how initially Bloodlines was an utter failure, but as I outlined near the end of my first section, after Troika Games folded up, Bloodlines blew up, selling nearly 10 times its initial sales over the course of 10 years or so. This was proof that Bloodlines was more than just a cult classic. It was able to sell 500,000 copies, which is not something to take lightly. What made Bloodlines so incredible as a game was its combination of setting, the writing, and the graphics. They all fit together rather cohesively. With a game based on the White Wolf universe, you expect something a lot more dark and mature than an abomination like, say, Twilight. Bloodlines had this in spades, starting from its very moody lighting, followed by its strong, memorable characters, and finished with exquisite writing. My first time playing Bloodlines, I couldn't quite shake how real the universe felt. Sure, vampires are not the least bit real, but the game was so immersive that the story it painted, it all felt very real to me. With iconic characters like Prince, Laughing Jack, Gimbal, and Officer Grunk, the cast of characters in Bloodlines range from diabolic to incredibly hilarious. The story in the game makes you want to choose sides, and with fun plot twists, it always feels like you are playing catch-up in regards to what is happening next. But make no mistake, Bloodlines certainly had its flaws. But flaws or not, the strong writing and setting in the game made the game worth slogging through the flaws. The legacy Troika Games left behind with Bloodlines was that a mature vampire game with an RPG-like story and choice system, it could be done. And it could be done well, flaws and all. But it was also a testament to the fans of Troika Games. Their unbelievable support of the game continued on for a decade and more after its release. Hopefully after this portion of the video, you have a better understanding of why Troika Games was such an influential and well-loved company. The legacy they left on the video game world can surely still be felt to this day. But as with all of my Death of a Game videos, we eventually reach the point where we have to figure out why the game or company in question failed. And so that's where the next part of the video comes into play. Why did Troika Games meet their ultimate demise? In the next portion of the video, I will outline the largest contributing factors to the death of Troika Games. Big dreams. 6 years, 3 games, that's a truly ludicrous number. In the span of 6 years, companies on average are lucky to get 2, let alone 1 game out. But Troika Games was able to get 3 of them. Sure, you can say that their titles are notoriously known for being buggy and unfinished, but they still have a level of quality and allure about them that other games with much larger development cycles and checkbooks couldn't even dream of. That's because Troika never stopped dreaming. They always had the idea that they could create wonderful products despite how small their team was. When Troika first started development on their first title, Arcanum, they only had 3 people working on the game for half a year, the founders. It wasn't until later in the development cycle that they expanded to 12 people. Yes, 12. Considering the sheer size of Arcanum, the idea that they thought that they could not only create a great game, but also create their own engine with it was a little bit ludicrous. Bloodlines had as much as 32 people working on it, which again by most standards is still small, especially for the scope of the game, a scope that, in my opinion, is much larger than a rival, say, Half-Life 2, which used the same engine as Bloodlines. Half-Life 2 had multi-dozens of millions and a full development team working on it. Troika undoubtedly had spunk, that's for sure. They weren't afraid, they came out swinging, and they came out with rather ambitious projects. But having such lofty goals and not the right infrastructure in place, or really just the manpower, meant that their goals were always going to be marred to some extent. Still, they couldn't be stopped in their attempt to create very ambitious titles, which was admirable and is why Troika Games games will always be remembered. But there is such a thing as dreaming too much. The vision of a strong culture-infused office space and workforce was admirable from Troika, but their inability to have an efficient enough team and team capability surely contributed to the death of Troika Games. But having too high of goals and not enough manpower wasn't the only reason that Troika Games died. Great, but unpolished projects. This point really piggybacks off my previous point, and is a bit of an addenda of sorts. I wanted to separate it because although having too large of goals and not enough people to work on these goals can hamper you, consistently creating unfinished products meant that there was also other issues at Troika Games. One of the defining characteristics, as I have previously outlined about Troika Games, was their ability to make top quality games in terms of strong immersion and storytelling. However, even though those are very strong points of Troika Games, they also highlighted severe weaknesses in consistency. The best example of this is Bloodlines. Early on in the game, the writing and universe are totally captivating, but after you reach about halfway to 3/4 of a way into the game feels like the bottom just collapses. They force you to do tons of linear exploring with forced combat and constant reused assets. I mean literally copy-pasted assets for hours of gameplay. This ends up making the latter part of Bloodlines experience far worse than the former. This can be chalked up to a number of things, of course, but the crux of the point that I wanted to make here is that them never being able to finish a game of theirs properly was another reason publishers simply didn't trust them. And the likeliest reason they struggled with this, well, that kind of ties into my next and final point on Troika's inability as a company. Art versus business. Vincent van Gogh was a famous painter in the 1800s. Pretty well known. He was a post-impressionist painter. The interesting thing about Van Gogh in regards to the story of Troika was although posthumously he was considered a great painter, during his life, he wasn't. And while the reasons for that could be many, I want to focus in on the discussion of art versus business. Van Gogh wasn't a good businessman. The idea was that he was skilled in the ways of art, but not business. The comparison, I feel, is apt, because Troika Games certainly did not lack talent. They had prior artists and programmers who worked on creating Fallout for Interplay, after all. This manifested itself in their other titles as well. They clearly had talent. Their worlds were always beautifully crafted, backed up with a depth of lore, but as Boyarsky pointed out himself, they lacked the business acumen to be able to procure the right publishers or funds for their projects, which made it to where they always had a ticking time bomb that they had to release the project rushing and crunch time, otherwise they were just going to go under. Boyarsky was quoted as saying, "After the lessons we learned on Arcanum, I think a better way to go about it would have been to get independent financing for the bulk of the dev cycle of a game, then bring it to publishers, when it was more than half finished, to help bring it to the market. Not to mention they experienced multiple instances of their products being yanked from them due to not adhering to publisher schedules. Whether or not that was more due to poor management, which is also business related, or they just didn't properly negotiate, we don't really know. Point being, art versus business, they were lacking in the business department. We should have found someone to run the business aspect of Troika," Boyarsky said, "so that Tim, Jason, and I could have focused all of our energy on the games." And that last quote pretty much sums it up for me. Kane, Anderson, and Boyarsky had and still have a strong ability to create a game and a world. They just didn't have the right kind of management-focused mind that is needed to drive a company to success. Troika's games are cult classics, and are heavily still played to this day, over a decade later. But the reason why I made the comparison with Van Gogh, of course, is that their titles were only able to really sell well after their death. And I couldn't think of more apt of a comparison, as Van Gogh experienced the same thing. Hopefully Troika Games will be remembered in some shred of the same light as someone like Van Gogh. But it's rather easy to see the parallels between the two. Now my final point I like to call bad luck, or you can kind of say poor decisions. This one's going to be super off script, and I'm not going to be reading anything off of my script for this. I'm not one of those people that necessarily like to blame the randomness of luck, and I certainly don't like to live my life relying on the idea or crying about it. But when you look at Troika Games' situation, you kind of have to feel for them. They had a lot of bad luck that plagued them. For example, the first publisher that they worked with, Sierra Entertainment, was very much going to be their sort of exclusive publisher. But Sierra Entertainment was facing its own issues. It had a bunch of layoffs, the company restructured, and ended up being partly purchased, in some business type of alliance with another company called Vivendi, which was a sort of investor/capital company. They weren't in a position to offer much assistance whenever Troika came back with the idea of doing a sequel, which they weren't necessarily against, but once again, they probably didn't have much choice in the matter. This is unfortunate because then this forced Troika to go make hasty decisions. To keep the company alive, they had to accept the contract from Atari. And well, they got lucky in that they were able to form a contract with Activision to make Bloodlines using the Source engine, which again seemed like a blessing, but it was more of a hindrance than a blessing, because the Source engine was so early on, it had so many issues. It was a prototype engine at the time, and even Half-Life was having issues. That's why they kept delaying the development of Half-Life 2. That was sort of bad luck for Troika, because they chose an engine that certainly was powerful, but just wasn't really at the place that it was supposed to be at the time. Then of course the contract that they signed deemed that they weren't able to release their game until Valve released their game, and since Activision was pissed that they went over budget, they essentially forced Troika to release the game the same day as Half-Life 2, which, once again, is another instance of bad luck. Now, you can't just chalk up everything to bad luck. Certainly, Troika had some level of agency in the matter, and they certainly didn't help themselves when it came to poor decisions that they made. The saying is that pressure can make diamonds, but sometimes these diamonds can be a little bit flawed in some way. And that was sort of how I remembered Troika Games. But despite their flaws, it's important to remember Troika Games for the good that they did, and try and look past their unfinished projects. because the titles that they were able to create truly were remarkable. Conclusion. After this last section of the video, you should have a better understanding of why Troika Games ultimately died. The good news for Troika fans is that Tim Kaine and Leonard Boyarsky are currently working on an unknown project that Boyarsky deemed a dream project. It's exciting to think that in 2017 and beyond, there's a chance that we might get to see another cult classic from the two. Although with Obsidian's backings and years of experience, perhaps it's their chance at commercial success past being such a niche product. Only time will tell. Bloodlines is a project I remember most fondly from Troika, as it was a project that I didn't play that long ago, but even 10 years later, I was still very much enthralled by the story, and wished desperately it was properly finished. Thanks for watching the video as always, guys. Troika Games was a fan favorite surely, but a company that nonetheless had many issues and was ultimately unable to prevail. But there are so many other games and companies that we can cover in this series, so if you want to see more videos like this, hit that subscribe button and make sure to click that bell, that way you know when I upload. My current upload schedule is supposed to be weekly, by Sunday each week, but sometimes I end up making that bi-weekly. If you want to support me monetarily, please check out my Patreon link, and thanks for the support. You can also click on my Amazon affiliate link, which does not add anything to the final price of your purchase on Amazon, but it does help me with a little bit of a kickback. If you want to check me out on social media, where you can find updates on when my next videos are coming or just talk with me personally, you can check out my Twitter link. And if you want to watch me do some streams on twitch.tv, be sure to follow me on my twitch.tv channel. And the best way to reach me, or, well, reach another group of like-minded gamers where you can debate and discuss different things, and we have weekly games on Saturdays, join my Discord, which is completely free. Now, Discord I'm very approachable on. You can come talk to me, you can come leave suggestions, and whatever else. All links, of course, are in the description. And that's all I have for you guys. nerdSlayer, out.